the unbelievable ancestors of self. It is important to keep a sense of the reality of these transitionary times, even though it is somewhat challenging to do so, and that reality is that because of the newfound ability humans now had to reflect off the creation, the experience for them began to change profoundly. They could now see the light of day and the splendour of the creation in a way that they had never experienced before. Their eyes had been opened. But not only did the experience begin to change for each human animal body, the experience for the earth as the creator of those bodies also began to change. Let me explain. As I mentioned in the previous section, it was a point in time that marks the most profound event in evolutionary history, the place where primitive human animals began the transition to modern thinking human beings. And to reiterate, the nature of this transitionary dynamic was twofold and directly related. First, the human animal was developed so that it could express the full nature of consciousness, and this, in turn, affected the experience of consciousness. And second, as a result of this expression through the animal, the physicality of the animal began to mutate, specifically the brain and its ability to process information as a result of the emerging world of memory. This processing of information through those human bodies allowed each body to begin identifying with the creation, and in turn, a sense of being something separate from it began to emerge. Consequently, as the identification increased, so too did the sense of separation from it, which fueled a growing sense of individuality or self. Or in other words, as individuality or selfishness grew over time, the human connection with the earth and the natural state diminished. The human experience of universal consciousness began to reduce to express through each of us as what we now know and name as the ego. From the first days of humans looking out to understand the world in which they lived until now, the brain of every body has been engaged in a long journey towards understanding that world and our relationship to it. This takes us right back to the beginning of the work, where it is noted that humankind's wondering about who we are, where we came from, and why is the impulse behind both the scientific and the spiritual quest for understanding. This ultimate understanding is the essence of the journey or path to enlightenment, being a total knowledge of both the inner and the outer. This maps the general territory we're heading in understanding the civilization of our species and the meaning and purpose of our lives. As the Earth's own consciousness continued to push out through the bodies of early humans to reflect off the creation, more and more images of what was out there began to gather in the emerging human mind to become perceptible or cognizable things. Taking the caveman art of drawing bisons as an example once again to help us understand, after sufficient reflecting off the reality of bisons in existence, an image of bison began to form in the new vibrational world of personal memory. Thus, the people of the time could express these emerging mental images as drawings and paintings in their caves. But not only could they identify with the animals they hunted each day and the environment they lived in, they could also begin to identify with all things, everything, including their own kind. They began to see and compare themselves with others to note differences between them in appearance and behaviour, and although they could not necessarily express those observations, concepts and understandings began to stir within them. Comparisons and associations like these continued to increase, building and strengthening an emerging conceptual world as they did. After a period of time, this accumulation of conceptual imagery became information that begged to be referred to somehow. As an extension and adaptation of the natural expression of sounds the early human animal could make, the naming of things could now begin to develop. The consistent expression of the same sound for a particular thing developed over time to become a specific word for that thing. Such a word, of course, is a noun. Equally, the actions, behaviours, and relationships between those named objects encouraged the formation of other words to explain them, and this describes the development of verbs. It was in this way that the basis of language emerged. As naming and language continued to develop, The early people found they could use it to communicate with each other. Words and phrases could be formed to share ideas, and the opportunity for increased creativity and complex social structure, indeed culture, now became a possibility. And as language continued to evolve, creative opportunities to use it also became a possibility. The more eloquent discovered that they could use language to craft and share stories about their experiences. Over time, they discovered that they could even embellish these stories with additional information drawn from memory to present ideas to others that were perhaps more imaginary than descriptive of actual events. Naturally, these storytellers came to learn that their embellished stories were sometimes more interesting than the truth, and eventually the ability to tell stories that were constructed entirely from disparate memories became possible. Thus, the notion of fiction was born, and in the knowledge that such stories could be told and received with great interest, so too it may be here that the beginnings of entertainment, maybe even humour, first arose. These fictions were the first departure from observing and reporting on fact alone. They represented a kind of pseudo-reality, which in turn offered all kinds of new creative possibilities. This is an exceedingly interesting and significant point. Before the human psyche formed, the primitive human animal could only respond to its immediate environment, the physical world. And although the awareness had not yet developed, the experience for those primitives would have been one of being and knowing where they were in every moment. If they were looking at a tree, then they were looking at a tree, straightforward and simple. But as language developed and people began to share stories with each other, new possibilities began to arise. The concept of tree was something that could now be discussed without the necessary existence of it as a physical reality in the moment. Consequently, the emergence of the conceptual world of memory introduced an entirely new principle, belief. For someone who had never seen a tree before, someone else could now describe to them what a tree was. And so, without them ever having had the direct experience of a tree, they could now see it in their mind's eye and could believe that it was true. It was this newfound ability to believe in things, and further, to believe in them collectively, that has allowed humans to unite in certain mindsets to become the all-powerful, controlling force that we now are on this planet. Ideas of this nature beautifully expressed and explored in great detail by Yuval Harari in his best-selling work, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. The ability for us to tell stories, share ideas, and believe in them is the main driving force behind the emergence of civilization, and as such, those who were best at it often gained great power to influence and control others. They rose to become rulers and authorities in the tribes, communities, and nations to which they belonged. For the first time, something other than evolved animal physical strength and fitness could now be used as a determiner of status. Interestingly, today the ability to use language effectively is considered an indicator of intelligence and therefore a powerful fitness indicator in a biological sense. Mate choice by both sexes over time has focused increasingly on intelligence as a major heritable component of biological fitness. Although language was now known and being used by the early people to communicate with each other, we must remember that it was not just human knowledge, it was universal knowledge. The developing skill and ability to use words could also be used by the earth itself to inform or direct a person as well. This could have occurred at any time as a communication from within a person's own being. Hence, it is possible to understand how personal conversations with and guidance from these voices may have birthed the fundamental basis of a relationship between humans and a separate and greater source or power, God. This inner dialogue would reduce over time to become the common experience of what we now know as self-talk. Coupled with some other powerful events that were about to happen, the ground for early humans believing in God or other influential forces separate from themselves would be firmly established. The continued growth and expansion of interpretation through each early human body and brain gathered, fed, and strengthened the effective existence of the human psyche. As a place under construction, not unlike the way in which the universe itself began to form, the possibility for a kind of alter consciousness or phony spirit also began to arise as the environment became more substantial. In the same way that all creatures have a spirit, a unique consciousness of their own given the arrangement and interaction of all the firmamental bodies from which it is made, so too phony spirits began to arise from the existence of memories in the world of past. Here, in this place, these emerging spirits or entities began to realize that they could influence the creation in varying ways and degrees depending on their strength and power. Because they dwelled in the zone between worlds, between the psyche and the physical, these entities effectively stood between what was intended and what appeared, stood in the way of the natural immediacy and intent of eternal creativity and expression in the universe. This allowed them to operate as agents of consciousness, go between spirits in a real but secondary world, and they began to see that they had the power to affect existence. They learned that they could influence the behavior of things on earth and the unfolding of events by influencing and communicating through the earth's creatures, any human, animal, or in fact any expression in existence at all. They began to turn things into something more aligned with their own intentions, and eventually developed the power also to appear or materialize from this intermediate ethereal world as anything they wished and at will. These entities were indeed powerful, influential forces, and it is interesting to note that there is a great deal of evidence to support their existence. There are stories from our ancient history that talk of a time when these entities lived and walked with mortal human beings of the day, and the essential nature of what they did has been captured and reported to us today through the myths and legends that appear in the history of every culture on earth. These entities were the gods and goddesses of our ancient past and the ancestors of our modern sense of self. In the next section, we look to see how the myths and legends of the past are not just entertaining stories, but indicators to the conditions that birthed us as creative human beings.